On the surface, Brooklyn, New York, in the late summer of 2019, was alive with its usual rhythm. Streets buzzing with yellow cabs, food carts filling the air with the smell of roasted peanuts and hot pretzels, and families enjoying the last warmth before autumn settled in. Yet, hidden among the chaos of the city, there lived a teenager whose inner world was far darker than anyone around him could have imagined. His name was Ethan Miller, an 18-year-old who had grown up moving from one foster home to another, carrying with him a wound that never fully healed, the absence of his biological mother. Ethan's story began long before 2019, back in February of 2001, when he was abandoned only a few weeks after birth. His mother, Angela Carter, then just 19, left him on the steps of a Catholic church in Queens during the freezing winter night. Wrapped in nothing but a thin blanket, he was discovered by a priest who immediately contacted Child Protective Services. From that moment on, Ethan's life was defined by a lack of permanence. He moved from one foster family to another, sometimes staying a few months, sometimes a few years, never long enough to feel that he truly belonged. As Ethan grew older, the question of why became unbearable. Why had his mother abandoned him? Why hadn't she returned, or at least reached out to explain? Each birthday he celebrated with strangers sharpened his resentment. He watched other children get picked up from school by their mothers, while he stood alone, waiting for a foster parent who often arrived late, if at all. By the time Ethan was a teenager, he carried with him a quiet but poisonous anger toward the woman who had brought him into this world and then discarded him. School was never easy for Ethan. He was intelligent. Teachers noted that he had a gift for writing and a strong curiosity for history, but his behavior was often volatile. He fought with classmates, resisted authority, and occasionally ran away from his foster homes. Counselors attributed his struggles to attachment disorder and the trauma of abandonment, but little was done to provide long-term help. Instead, Ethan learned to bury his emotions, keeping a journal where he poured out his bitterness in long, angry entries. By the time 2018 came around, Ethan had begun using social media not just as a way to connect with others, but as a platform to vent his feelings. His posts often carried undertones of frustration and loneliness, though most of his peers dismissed them as the typical angst of a teenager. But hidden between jokes and music recommendations were darker thoughts, questions about revenge, cryptic messages about pain, and occasional references to a woman he never named directly. Unbeknownst to Ethan, Angela Carter had built a new life for herself in Manhattan. After leaving her infant son, she moved on quickly, cutting all ties with the past. She worked in retail, eventually securing a steady job at a department store, and years later married a man who had no idea she had once abandoned a child. Angela presented herself to the world as an ordinary woman in her late 30s, with no visible scars or secrets. For Ethan, however, the wound was still raw. In his mind, Angela had committed an unforgivable betrayal. The fact that she lived only a few miles away, while he spent years feeling unwanted, fed his obsession. As his 18th birthday approached in March 2019, Ethan began searching for her online. With the ease of the internet, it did not take long. A name here, a public record there, and soon he had a clear picture of the woman he had spent his life imagining. She was not dead, nor lost, nor unreachable. She was alive, working, smiling in photos on Facebook, enjoying the kind of life he believed she had stolen from him. It was in those months that Ethan's resentment hardened into something more dangerous. His journal entries shifted from sadness to rage, from longing to hatred. He wrote about betrayal, about justice, and about reclaiming what was stolen from him. Those around him noticed his moods but never truly grasped the depth of his anger. For Ethan, the time of silent suffering was ending. The stage was being set for a crime that would shock even a city as hardened as New York. A crime born not of sudden madness, but of years of abandonment, secrecy, and resentment that had been quietly building in the shadows. By the summer of 2019, Brooklyn was a world of contrasts for Ethan Miller. On the outside, he was just another teenager finishing high school, scrolling through his phone, and hanging around local parks with friends. To neighbors and classmates, he appeared distant but not unusual, an 18-year-old trying to find his place in the chaos of New York City. Yet beneath the surface, Ethan was consumed by a private storm. Every day he spent online searching for traces of his mother only deepened his anger and resentment. Ethan lived in a modest foster home on Flatbush Avenue, under the care of a middle-aged couple who had agreed to take him in until he aged out of the system. His foster parents described him as polite but detached, a young man who spent long hours in his room with his laptop. He rarely joined family dinners, preferring instead to stay isolated, headphones in, typing furiously into his journal or chatting with strangers on social media platforms. They assumed it was normal teenage behavior, a mix of independence and moodiness. What they didn't realize was that Ethan had become obsessed with Angela Carter, the woman who had abandoned him 18 years earlier. In May of that year, Ethan finally confirmed Angela's identity through a series of online searches. He found her Facebook account, where she appeared to live a normal middle-class life in Manhattan. Her profile showed her working at a Macy's department store, smiling at work parties, taking vacation photos with friends, and sharing inspirational quotes. Ethan stared at those pictures for hours, consumed by a sense of betrayal. There she was, living comfortably, while he had spent his entire childhood bouncing between foster families, struggling to feel wanted. The more he saw, the more Ethan's anger grew. He began posting vague but emotional messages on Twitter and Instagram. One entry read, "Imagine being thrown away like trash and then watching the person who threw you away live happily like nothing happened." Another said, "Some wounds never heal. They just wait." To outsiders, these posts seemed like typical teenage dramatics, easily ignored or dismissed. But for Ethan, they were signals of the storm inside him. Hints of something darker he was slowly planning. During this time, Ethan's friends noticed subtle changes in his behavior. He grew more withdrawn, often turning down invitations to hang out. When he did spend time with them, his conversations returned repeatedly to themes of betrayal, abandonment, and anger toward parents in general. One friend recalled later that Ethan once said, "If I ever meet the woman who gave birth to me, she'll regret what she did." At the time, the friend laughed it off, assuming it was just a bitter joke. Nobody imagined he meant it literally. Meanwhile, Angela Carter had no idea her past was catching up to her. She was 37 years old, living in a small apartment in Manhattan with her husband, Daniel, a delivery driver who had been her partner for nearly a decade. Angela's life looked ordinary, even stable, but it was built on a foundation of secrecy. Daniel didn't know about the baby she had abandoned back in 2001. Angela had told him she never wanted children, using that as her excuse for avoiding the subject of family. To her coworkers, she was friendly and dependable, the kind of colleague who remembered birthdays and brought cupcakes to the break room. None of them suspected she carried the weight of a long-buried decision that had left scars on a child she never raised. The city around them buzzed with its usual intensity. Tourists flocked to Times Square, commuters rushed through subway tunnels, and sirens wailed in the distance as if marking the constant heartbeat of New York. To Angela, these were ordinary days. She went to work, shopped for groceries, and spent evenings watching TV with Daniel. She had no idea that a young man across the river in Brooklyn was plotting to change her life forever. Ethan's online activity became more troubling as summer deepened. In July 2019, he began writing long posts late at night, sometimes paragraphs filled with rage, despair, and cryptic references to a reckoning. One of his posts read, "The past doesn't stay buried. It comes back and it demands payment." His followers, mostly other teenagers, scrolled past these words without thinking twice. But one of his foster siblings, a younger boy who shared the same home, stumbled upon Ethan's posts and felt uneasy. He mentioned them casually to their foster parents, but they dismissed it as teenage frustration. The truth was Ethan had started to shape a plan. For years he had dreamed of confronting Angela, but now for the first time he knew where she lived, where she worked, and what her life looked like. He had already mapped out bus routes from Brooklyn to her apartment in Manhattan, studied the store hours where she worked, and even stood outside Macy's once, watching from across the street as she laughed with coworkers. He didn't approach her then, he wasn't ready, but the image burned into his memory. It was the proof he needed. She was real, she was there, and she was living as if he had never existed. As the days ticked toward September, Ethan's bitterness crystallized into determination. In his journal, he began writing not only about his anger but about actions, specific steps he imagined taking. "She thinks she's free from what she did," one entry read. "She isn't. She owes me everything and I'll collect it." The stage was set. Ethan was no longer a boy crying out for answers. He was a young man preparing for confrontation, one that would soon spiral into tragedy. What began as a search for his mother was evolving into something far darker. a mission for vengeance that no one around him recognized until it was too late. The turning point in Ethan Miller's life came on the night of September 14, 2019. It was a humid Saturday evening in Brooklyn, the kind where the air hung heavy and the city felt restless. Ethan sat in his dimly lit bedroom, scrolling through Facebook on his laptop. His foster parents were asleep, and the street outside was quiet except for the occasional honk of a taxi. As he clicked through photos of Angela Carter, his biological mother, he came across a new post she had shared just hours earlier. It was a smiling selfie of Angela and her husband Daniel at a restaurant in Manhattan, celebrating their wedding anniversary. Angela wore a blue dress, her hand resting casually on Daniel's shoulder as they leaned in toward the camera. The caption read, "So grateful for this man and for the beautiful life we've built together. Here's to many more years of happiness." To anyone else it was a harmless, joyful post. But to Ethan, it felt like a knife twisting in his chest. The words "beautiful life" burned in his mind. He had spent 18 years without stability, without family, without the love of a parent. And here was the woman who had abandoned him, flaunting her happiness as if he never existed. Ethan stared at the photo for a long time, his hands trembling on the keyboard. His mind spiraled into anger and bitterness. In his journal, he wrote later that night, "She has a life. She has love. She has everything she took from me. And she acts like I'm nothing. She doesn't deserve it. Not anymore." That night marked the shift from thought to action. Ethan had often fantasized about confronting Angela, about making her face the pain she had caused. But until then, those were just angry dreams scribbled on paper. Now, fueled by the image of her happiness, Ethan began making real preparations. He opened a new note on his phone and started outlining what he called the reckoning. Over the next week, Ethan's behavior grew more erratic. He skipped classes, stayed out late, and spent long hours wandering the streets of Brooklyn. On the night of September 18th, he took the subway into Manhattan and stood across the street from Angela's apartment building. He watched as lights flickered on in her window, imagining her inside, safe and comfortable. He didn't knock, didn't approach, just observed. But in his mind, he was rehearsing, preparing himself for the confrontation he believed was inevitable. The moment that cemented his decision came only days later, on September 21, 2019. Angela posted another update on Facebook, a photo of herself holding a coworker's newborn baby at Macy's. Her caption read, "Nothing more precious than holding new life in your arms. Congratulations to my dear friend Emily on her beautiful baby girl." When Ethan saw the post, his vision blurred with rage. The hypocrisy was unbearable. Here was the woman who had left him on a church doorstep, cradling another baby with tenderness and admiration. To Ethan, it was a mockery of everything he had endured. He immediately turned to Twitter, where he typed out a chilling message, "Some people don't deserve second chances. The past always comes knocking." Few paid attention. It was buried in the noise of the internet, just another cryptic line from a teenager. But in Ethan's mind, it was a declaration of intent. He had crossed a mental threshold. The anger that had simmered for years had reached a boiling point, and there was no turning back. In the days that followed, Ethan began gathering tools. He withdrew money from his small savings account, enough to buy a folding knife at a sporting goods store in Brooklyn. He purchased a black hoodie and gloves. At night, he rehearsed scenarios in his head. Would he confront Angela at her apartment? At her workplace? On the street? Each imagined version ended the same way, with Angela paying for what she had done. Meanwhile, Angela went about her life, blissfully unaware. She continued working at Macy's, greeting customers with a smile, chatting with coworkers, and coming home each evening to Daniel. She had no reason to suspect that her abandoned past was alive and watching her from the shadows. On September 27, 2019, Ethan made his first direct move. He boarded the subway again, this time during the afternoon, and rode into Manhattan. He carried the folding knife in his backpack, hidden beneath notebooks and loose papers. He walked the crowded sidewalks, blending in with the sea of commuters and shoppers, until he reached Macy's Herald Square. From across the street, he spotted Angela at the entrance, greeting a customer as she handed out promotional flyers. Ethan froze, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. This was the woman he had imagined for years, the ghost who haunted his childhood, now standing just a few feet away. She looked older than her photos, with faint lines around her eyes, but her smile was warm and genuine. It infuriated him even more. How could she smile so easily, when her own son had spent years drowning in pain? He lingered there for nearly an hour, watching her. Twice he considered crossing the street, confronting her then and there. But fear held him back. He wasn't ready, not yet. Instead, he turned away, retreating into the crowd. But the seed had been planted. He had seen her with his own eyes, breathed the same air. There was no going back. That night, Ethan's journal entry was stark and chilling. "I saw her today. She doesn't even know who I am. She looked happy. She won't be for long." The triggering incident was complete. What had begun with a single Facebook post, a simple photo celebrating love, had ignited a chain of events that would soon spiral into tragedy. Ethan's obsession was no longer confined to late-night writings and angry thoughts. It was alive, moving, and waiting for the moment to strike. The crime that had been brewing in silence finally erupted on the evening of October 2, 2019, in Manhattan. It was around 8:15 p.m. when Angela Carter was found collapsed just outside the entrance of her apartment building on West 34th Street. Neighbors who heard the commotion rushed outside and saw her bleeding from multiple stab wounds. Someone called 911, and within minutes, NYPD officers and paramedics arrived at the scene. Angela was still breathing but weak, and despite desperate attempts to save her, she was pronounced dead at 8:47 p.m. at Bellevue Hospital. The murder shocked the neighborhood. Angela had been well-liked, known as a friendly neighbor who often greeted others in the hallway and offered to water plants when people were away. The idea that someone would brutally attack her in such a public location seemed unimaginable. Detectives from the NYPD's Homicide Division immediately began their work, treating the case as a high-priority investigation. At the scene, officers noted several important details. Angela's purse was still clutched tightly in her hand, suggesting that robbery had not been the motive. Her phone lay shattered on the sidewalk as if it had fallen during the struggle. Witnesses described seeing a young man in a dark hoodie fleeing the area moments before Angela collapsed, but no one had gotten a clear look at his face. Surveillance cameras from nearby businesses were pulled quickly, though the footage showed only a blurry figure disappearing into the night. The case began with interviews. Daniel Carter, Angela's husband, was questioned first. Shaken and grieving, he told detectives that Angela had left work around 7:30 p.m. and taken her usual subway home. She texted him shortly before 8 o'clock to say she was walking from the station and would be home soon. By the time he received a call from a neighbor about the attack, she was already being rushed to the hospital. Daniel was adamant that Angela had no enemies, no conflicts, and no reason for anyone to want her dead. Detectives then turned their attention to Angela's workplace. At Macy's, her co-workers were equally shocked. They described her as dependable, kind, and friendly. Several mentioned that she had been particularly cheerful that week, talking about saving up for a short vacation with Daniel. When asked if she had ever expressed fear or mentioned someone following her, the answer was unanimously no. But detectives soon discovered an unusual clue. When they accessed Angela's Facebook account, they noticed a string of recent comments under her photos. Most were from friends congratulating her on her anniversary or complimenting her outfit. But buried among them was a disturbing message from an anonymous account. "The past always comes back. You can't run forever." The account had no profile picture and only a handful of posts. Investigators flagged it immediately, suspecting it could be linked to the attack. Meanwhile, the medical examiner's office released its findings. Angela had suffered 4 stab wounds to the torso and 1 defensive wound on her right hand, indicating she had tried to fight off her attacker. The blade used was consistent with a folding knife, around 4 inches long. This detail matched the kind of weapon that could be purchased easily at local sporting goods stores, complicating the search for a specific suspect. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood again, hoping to identify the young man witnesses described. One woman, a resident of the building across the street, said she had seen someone loitering near Angela's building earlier that week. "He was just standing there in a black hoodie watching," she recalled. At the time, she thought he might have been waiting for someone. Now she wasn't so sure. The investigation took a new turn when detectives subpoenaed data from Angela's phone. Though the device was damaged, technicians managed to recover some information. Among her text messages was a recent one she had sent to a friend. "Something strange happened yesterday. I thought I saw a young man staring at me outside Macy's. It gave me chills, but maybe I'm just imagining things. This revelation alarmed investigators. It suggested that Angela may have been followed or watched in the days leading up to her murder. Detectives theorized that the killer could have been someone with a personal grudge, rather than a random attacker. As the days passed, the NYPD intensified their search. Flyers were distributed across Manhattan and Brooklyn, asking the public for information about a young male suspect seen fleeing the crime scene. News outlets quickly picked up the story, reporting on the shocking murder of a well-liked retail worker. Headlines read, "Manhattan woman stabbed outside home," and "Police search for hooded suspect in brutal attack." Behind the scenes, investigators began to notice a troubling pattern. When they traced the anonymous Facebook account that had left the cryptic comment, they discovered it was linked to an email address registered under the name Ethan Miller. Further digging revealed that Ethan was Angela's biological son, abandoned as an infant in 2001. The revelation stunned detectives. Could this young man, only 18, have harbored enough hatred to kill the woman who had given birth to him? The pieces began to align. Ethan matched the description of the hooded suspect. His social media was filled with dark posts about betrayal, abandonment, and revenge. And his last known foster address placed him in Brooklyn, just a short subway ride from Angela's apartment. For the investigators, the picture was becoming clearer, though still incomplete. By October 5, 2019, Ethan Miller's name had officially entered the case file as a person of interest. Detectives knew they needed to find him quickly, not only to question him but to prevent the possibility of further violence. The investigation that had started with a bloody sidewalk and a shattered phone was now pointing toward a story of abandonment, resentment, and a young man's descent into rage. The stage was set for the next phase, digging deeper into Ethan's life, his motives, and the hidden history that connected him to the victim. The initial investigation had provided more questions than answers, but one thing was certain: Angela Carter's murder was no random act of violence. It was personal. By early October 2019, the NYPD Homicide Division had already painted Ethan Miller as their prime suspect. His online activity, his connection to Angela Carter, and his proximity to the crime scene made him the obvious target. But as detectives dug deeper into his past, the story that emerged was far more complicated than a simple case of revenge. On October 7, 2019, detectives visited Ethan's foster home in Brooklyn. His foster parents, the Thompsons, were stunned to learn that he was being investigated. They described him as quiet, sometimes moody, but never violent. "He was always polite to us," Mrs. Thompson insisted. "He kept to himself most of the time, writing in his journal, listening to music. I can't imagine him hurting anyone." Yet when detectives asked if Ethan had been home on the night of October 2nd, their answers grew hesitant. They admitted that they hadn't seen him after dinner. He often came and went without saying where he was going. Inside his room, detectives found troubling evidence. On his desk was a black hoodie, still damp from recent rain, and a pair of gloves. More disturbingly, tucked inside a drawer was a notebook filled with angry, detailed entries. One passage read, "She walks around like she's innocent, but she knows what she did. She left me to rot. I'll make sure she never forgets." Another, dated September 27th, the day Ethan had watched Angela outside Macy's, read, "I saw her today. She smiled like everything was fine. It won't be for long." But then came the twist. When detectives checked Ethan's phone records, they discovered something unexpected. At the exact time of Angela's murder, between 8 o'clock and 8:20 p.m., his phone had pinged off a cell tower in Queens, several miles from the crime scene. Even more, security footage from a convenience store in Queens appeared to show Ethan inside the shop at 8:12 p.m., buying a soda. The timestamp matched the period of the attack almost exactly. This revelation threw the case into confusion. If Ethan was indeed in Queens at that time, it would have been nearly impossible for him to stab Angela on West 34th Street in Manhattan and then appear on camera minutes later. Was it possible that someone else had killed her? Or had Ethan staged an alibi by deliberately leaving his phone behind while someone else used it? Detectives debated the possibilities. Some argued that the store footage didn't entirely clear him. The figure in the video looked like Ethan, but the image was grainy. Others suggested that maybe Ethan had an accomplice, someone who carried out the attack while he provided himself with an alibi. But who would have been willing to kill Angela for him? As investigators considered these questions, another piece of evidence emerged. A neighbor from Angela's building came forward on October 9th, reporting that she had seen a man in a dark hoodie loitering near the entrance on the night of the murder. At first, she assumed it was a teenager waiting for someone, but when she later saw the news reports, she realized the timing matched Angela's killing. Crucially, she described the man as being taller and heavier than Ethan Miller. This testimony added a new wrinkle. If the witness was correct, perhaps Ethan hadn't been the one to wield the knife. Maybe someone else had carried out the attack, someone with a personal connection to Angela. Detectives began to broaden their search, looking into Angela's social circle. They interviewed co-workers, neighbors, and even old acquaintances from Queens. That was when they uncovered a shocking secret Angela had kept hidden. Before marrying Daniel, she had been in an on-and-off relationship with a man named Mark Rivera, who had a criminal record for assault. Rivera had lived in the Bronx and had known Angela around the time she abandoned Ethan. He was never involved in Ethan's life, but according to co-workers, Angela had once confided that Rivera was dangerous and that she had cut ties with him years ago. Detectives tracked Rivera down for questioning, but when they visited his last known address, they learned he had moved months earlier. His whereabouts were uncertain. At the same time, Ethan's behavior was drawing increasing concern. Though detectives hadn't arrested him yet, they kept him under surveillance. He spent long hours wandering the city, sometimes lingering near Angela's old workplace, sometimes sitting alone in public parks. His social media posts grew darker. On October 10th, he wrote, "Justice isn't always clean. Sometimes it takes more than one hand to make it happen." To investigators, the wording suggested the possibility of an accomplice, or at least that Ethan wanted people to believe so. The public too was caught up in the twist. News reports had already painted Ethan as the abandoned son turned killer, but when leaks about his possible alibi surfaced, the story shifted. Some saw him as a tragic figure, a young man scarred by childhood trauma, now being scapegoated for a crime he might not have committed. Others insisted the evidence of his journal and online posts was too strong to ignore. Commentators on television debated his guilt, while social media lit up with speculation. Detectives were now facing two possibilities. Either Ethan had staged an elaborate cover, or someone else, possibly connected to Angela's past, had carried out the murder. To complicate matters, Daniel Carter, Angela's husband, admitted during a follow-up interview that Angela had seemed nervous in the weeks leading up to her death. She mentioned once that she felt like someone was watching her, Daniel said. "I thought it was just city paranoia. I never imagined it was real." By mid-October, the investigation was split down the middle. Some detectives pushed for Ethan's arrest, citing his journals, his threats, and his deep resentment. Others argued that the alibi and witness testimony suggested another hand was involved. The twist in the case had transformed it from a straightforward narrative into a complex puzzle. What had begun as a seemingly obvious act of revenge by an abandoned son was now clouded by uncertainty. Was Ethan truly the killer, or was he just the ghost of Angela's past, hovering around the edges of a crime committed by someone else? The answer remained elusive, but the search for truth was only intensifying. The trial of 18-year-old Nathan Cole began on a chilly Monday morning, October 21, 2019, in the Manhattan Criminal Court. The courtroom was crowded with journalists, true crime bloggers, and ordinary citizens who had followed the shocking story online. Nathan's case had already captured national attention, not only because of the brutal nature of the crime but also because of the strange connection between his social media posts and the act itself. The question everyone wanted answered was clear. Had Nathan murdered his mother out of calculated revenge, or was he a deeply troubled young man driven to a breaking point? The prosecution wasted no time painting Nathan as cold and methodical. Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Turner stood before the jury and described him as a young man who carried hatred like a weapon. She recounted the morning of July 8th, when Nathan ambushed his mother in her apartment, stabbing her repeatedly before fleeing. Turner highlighted the Facebook post Nathan had made just hours before the crime, a chilling entry that read more like a public execution notice than a cry for help. On the other side, Nathan's defense attorney, Michael O'Hara, pushed back with a very different narrative. O'Hara argued that Nathan was not a monster but rather a victim, first abandoned by his mother as a baby, then failed by a system that never gave him the support he needed. "This is not the story of a ruthless killer," O'Hara told the jury. "This is the story of a child who was discarded, ignored, and left to carry scars too deep to heal." On that July morning he broke. The courtroom became a battlefield of perspectives. Witnesses were called: neighbors, friends, foster parents. A neighbor from the apartment building where the crime occurred described hearing a woman screaming and banging on the wall around 7:45 a.m. Another testified to seeing Nathan leaving the building, looking pale, shaking, and with blood on his shirt. These testimonies drew sharp reactions from the jury and audience, especially as the prosecution presented photos from the crime scene, images so graphic that several spectators turned away. Meanwhile, the defense focused on Nathan's upbringing. His foster mother, Karen Mitchell, took the stand and wept as she described raising him. She recalled how Nathan often asked about his biological mother, hoping one day to meet her. "He wanted to know why she left him," Mitchell said through tears. "He wanted closure, but instead he found rejection." The defense's strategy was clear: to humanize Nathan, to show that behind the act of violence stood years of emotional torment. But the prosecution countered with digital evidence that became the heart of the conflict. Detectives had retrieved months of online activity from Nathan's accounts. His journal entries, blog posts, and late-night tweets revealed a disturbing pattern. He wrote about revenge, fantasies of confronting his mother, and violent imagery directed toward women who abandoned their kids. One entry dated June 3, 2019, a month before the murder, read, "When she finally looks me in the eyes, I'll make sure she never looks away again." This evidence turned the trial into a moral maze. Was Nathan's hatred premeditated proof of guilt, or simply the ramblings of a damaged teen venting his pain? The jury's faces grew tense as prosecutors projected each post onto the screen, the words echoing through the silent courtroom. Nathan sat motionless at the defense table, his head down, never making eye contact with the images of his own writing. Outside the courtroom, the conflict raged on in the public sphere. Protesters gathered, some carrying signs that read "Justice for Maria," while others held placards saying, "System failed Nathan." News anchors debated nightly whether Nathan should be punished as a cold-blooded murderer or treated as a tragic figure shaped by abandonment. Social media boiled with opinions. Hashtags like #JusticeForMaria and #FreeNathan trended simultaneously, splitting the public into two camps. The rising conflict reached its peak during cross-examination of the lead detective, Marcus Rivera. O'Hara questioned him sharply about the lack of psychological evaluation before Nathan's arrest. "Detective, were you aware that my client had a history of depression and suicidal thoughts?" Rivera admitted that while such records existed, they hadn't been prioritized in the investigation. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The defense seized the moment, claiming the system had rushed to prosecute Nathan as a criminal without first examining his mental health. The clash of narratives left the jury visibly unsettled. Each day, the weight of the decision grew heavier, the air inside the courtroom thick with tension. Was Nathan a murderer born of hate, or a broken young man pushed past his limits? On November 14, 2019, after 3 weeks of testimony, closing arguments, and hours of deliberation, the jury finally returned with a verdict. The courtroom was packed, every seat taken, and the atmosphere was suffocating with anticipation. Nathan Cole, now pale and visibly thinner than when he was first arrested, sat between his attorneys, his hands trembling slightly as the clerk stood to read the decision. On the charge of second-degree murder, the clerk said, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Nathan Cole, guilty." The words fell heavy in the room. Gasps echoed, followed by silence. Nathan lowered his head, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. Some jurors looked pained, others resolute, but the verdict was final. Maria Cole's family members sobbed quietly in the back row, clutching each other's hands. Judge Eleanor Whitmore then addressed the court. In her sentencing remarks, she acknowledged the tragedy of the case. "This is one of those moments where justice feels imperfect," she said. "A young man shaped by abandonment and anger took a life that should have been sacred to him. And now 2 lives are lost, Maria's in death and Nathan's in confinement." Nathan was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The decision sparked immediate reactions both inside and outside the courtroom. Some applauded, believing justice had been served for Maria. Others shook their heads, convinced the system had once again failed to recognize mental illness as a root cause of violence. In the weeks that followed, media coverage intensified. Major outlets ran headlines like "The Facebook Killer," "How an Online Confession Led to Murder," and "Justice or Failure: The Case of Nathan Cole." Documentaries and podcasts dissected the trial, replaying the Facebook post that had foreshadowed the tragedy. On social media, the debate raged on, with supporters creating pages advocating for Nathan's appeal, while Maria's friends called for stricter protections for victims of family violence. Inside prison, Nathan's life shifted into silence. Letters poured in, some from strangers who sympathized with his pain, others from people condemning him as a monster. He rarely responded. Fellow inmates noted that he spent long hours in the prison library, reading books on psychology and history, as if searching for answers to questions no one else could answer for him. For Maria's family, closure remained elusive. Her sister Angela told reporters outside the courthouse, "We lost Maria, and in a way we lost Nathan too. There's no victory here, only sorrow." The case of Nathan Cole became a haunting reminder of the thin line between victimhood and violence, and of how unresolved trauma can spiral into tragedy. Years later, people would still recall the young man who announced his intentions on Facebook before carrying out an unthinkable act. His story, etched into New York's criminal history, served as both a warning and a lament, proof that some wounds, if left untreated, can destroy not just one life but two.